Actually, before I get into some deep questions, I think I first need to understand what exactly is the Trade and Law Centre NPC TRALAC, and what do you actually do?
Right. The Trade Law Centre is a non-profit based in South Africa. We describe ourselves as a capacity building organization. We do research, analysis of current trade and trade-related issues affecting African countries in the broad context, not only of intra-Africa trade, but also global trade issues that impact Africa. We train a lot of policymakers across the continent. We have a flagship program called our TRALAC Certificate Program, and once a year we have an intake of 25 policymakers from across the continent. We train them over a period of 3 months. It's rather heavy going, but very, very important. It's an interdisciplinary course covering trade law and policy issues. And then we have, as we did last week, a She Governs Trade program. This is for young women policymakers. So we cover trade issues, but we also focus on mentoring with experienced policymakers across the continent and professional skills development more generally. And then our third pillar of the work program is stakeholder engagement. Without dialogue, without involving the private sector, public sector, the non-profit sector, civil society organizations, labor organizations, we cannot make policy that truly addresses development concerns.
How can you industrialize when you do have an energy deficit? And also as well, how does that energy deficit play into all the other SDGs, such as the uplifting of poverty, boosting of economic space, probably even human rights, things like potable water, sewage systems, because they all seem to feed into the same thing. What are your thoughts?
If we think about industrial development, energy is a key input into every economic activity. Without energy, we cannot industrialize, we can't have productive agriculture systems, and of course services sectors can't work. And if we take a look at the digital economy, artificial intelligence and so on, it's all energy intensive. So this is one of the foundational requirements for industrialization. But energy is also a fundamental development imperative.
I heard 109 billion is the funding gap. Southern Africa only got 2.2 billion. Most of that went to South Africa and Mozambique. Okay, so therefore the financing isn't being attracted. Is that about policy and consistency, about putting in the right environment to attract that? Or is it just about the fact that businesses or private sector doesn't see it economically viable to do that in South Africa? What have you found in your research?
Andy, is probably all of the above, depending on the particular country, the particular sector and so on. If we look at investment in renewables, we have seen some important projects across the continent, within SADC, but also elsewhere. Some of them are government funded, some of them have been enabled by finance from development finance institutions, the World Bank, for example, but also our own DFIs, the African Development Bank, the Southern African Development Bank, our national development finance institutions. Some are blended finance, so a combination of different sources, but some are investments by the private sector. They see a viable economic opportunity.
I think, you talked about stakeholder engagement, and I'm sure when you said that, you didn't just mean government, you also meant the private sector as well. So, because we're not here talking about Southern Africa moving 100% to renewable or clean energy. I think that's not possible anywhere in the world, to be frank. We need a blend, but also we need the private sector to step up, because government really is not their role to be the leader in these sort of things. So what are you finding?
There's no longer energy generation only in an energy sector, if one could call it that, but the mines are generating. Even small businesses are putting up solar panels and they're generating, because in some countries, of course, energy security is a major impediment to business development, particularly for the SMME community. So we're starting to see an entire new configuration of energy generation across the economy, households going off a grid, taking a look at being self-sufficient when it comes to energy generation and so on. Some are partially sufficient, not entirely so, and so on. So we're starting to see that new options are available when it comes to generation. If we take a look at the Southern African region, of course, not all our countries are fossil fuel dependent. If we looked at Zambia, for example, now that's hydropower. And we've seen what a severe drought can do here.
Trudi, I've left this question for last because I know you're very passionate about this, and here I'm talking about young women and young women's development. I know this for a fact, so I've left it for last because that is how important I think it is. The programming or the deliberate effort to uplift young women, to make them entrepreneurs, to get them stand on their own 2 feet, to move away from this patriarchal system in Africa. I know you're very passionate about that through training. Talk to me about that.
Andy, this is something that is high on our agenda at TRALAC, absolutely. We work with women and youth and young women, tick both of those boxes. And from an economic perspective, it would make no sense if we exclude more than half the population. How do we make that work? And there are so many issues that need very specific solutions. The one that often comes up when it comes to women, to youth, and therefore young women in particular, access to finance. You know, here we have certain social norms, for example, related to inheritance of property, ownership of property, for example, and so on. Our financial system is still geared very much to a traditional approach to requiring collateral for loans. So what we need is change on all those fronts, absolutely, where the banks need to factor in that a young woman entrepreneur at a border post who may cross a border 4 or 5 times a day, trading food to her clients in the neighboring country, she has all the information about her client base, the prices they pay, the products sold, orders for future supply on her mobile phone. Is that not collateral? There could be a fintech solution to take that into account. I'm quite sure of it. So it really is addressing the specific challenges that we see that could simply open up so many more opportunities.
Bottom line is to ensure that whatever policy decisions are made must take into account all segments, all sectors of the economy, male, female, young, persons living with disabilities. Nobody must be left behind.
Nobody must be left behind. Otherwise, we're all left behind.
Trudi Hartzenberg, that's a great way to end. TRALAC, thank you so much for talking.
Thank you so much, Andy. Great pleasure.